وإذ أخذنا من النبيين ميثاقهم ومنك ومن نوح وإبراهيم وموسى وعيسى بن مريم وأخذنا منهم ميثاقا غليظا ليسأل الصادقين عن صدقهم وأعد للكافرين عذابا أليما يا أيها الذين آمنوا اذكروا نعمة الله عليكم إذ جاءتكم جنود فأرسلنا عليهم ريحا وجنودا لم تروها وكان الله بما تعملون بصيرا إذ جاءوكم من فوقكم ومن أسفل منكم وإذ زاغت الأبصار وبلغت القلوب الحناجر وتظنون بالله الظنونا هنالك ابتلي المؤمنون وزلزلوا زلزالا شديدا وإذ يقول المنافقون والذين في قلوبهم مرض ما وعدنا الله ورسوله إلا غرورا.
And remember when we took a covenant from the prophets as well as you, O Prophet, and from Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, the son of Mary. We did take a solemn covenant from all of them, so that he may question these men of truth about their delivery of the truth. And he has prepared a painful punishment for the disbelievers. O believers, remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's favour upon you when the enemy forces came to besiege you in Medina. So we sent against them a bitter wind and forces you could not see. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all-seeing of what you do. Remember when they came at you from east and west, when your eyes grew wild in horror and your hearts jumped into your throats, and you entertained conflicting thoughts about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then and there the believers were put to the test and were violently shaken. And remember when the hypocrites and those with sickness in their hearts said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his messenger have promised us nothing but delusion.
So inshallah today we're going to go through the second session of this 9-session course on the last 100 years of Muslim history. And I have titled this one, A Bad Piece of Art. There's a number of images on this slide, all of which we are going to discuss. And the period that we're going to be studying is going to be the late Ottoman period. So this is kind of about 1830s up until 1924, which was the official disbandment of the Ottoman Empire. I don't like to call it empire, to be honest, because that has its own derogatory connotations, but the Ottomans. And then we will speak about the period of 1912, or within that we're going to speak about the period of 1912 up until 1920. All of this is very important. And as I mentioned in my preamble, it's vital in order to really understand what's happening in the Middle East today and the wider Muslim world, particularly, but not exclusively, Palestine. It's incredibly important to understand what happened in this period, because what happened in this period has defined the very experiences that we've lived until today. Now, art is something that I like. It's a bit boring to some people, but I quite like it. I did not go to a grammar or posh school. I went to a state school. In fact, my school was the bottom 20 of the country. Big up Kelmscott, E17, Walthamstow. Anyway, now, so art is something that I've come to appreciate. And you know, art tells its own story. Because, for example, these pictures here are from the Renaissance period, right? So during the Renaissance period, you had a number of different artists who came about. For example, Da Vinci was one of them, Leonardo da Vinci, the Mona Lisa and all of that. Now, Renaissance art was ultimately a reflection of some of the ideas that people were holding at that time. The ideas included things like freedom, things like liberty, fraternity, etc. So the art became an expression of some of those central ideas that was present within that culture at that particular time. Islamic art, which I'm sure most of you have seen in your travels back home, even in the country, for example in places like Cambridge, you know, the Eco Mosque in Cambridge, and even your local masjid, or if any of you have gone to Istanbul or wherever it may be, Islamic art was similar. Islamic art is there to express the wonders of Islamic civilization, but more specifically, there to captivate the onlooker with the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And art often creates layers of meaning, so you start to read deeper and deeper and deeper into the art. Okay? But sometimes art is just hideous. Sometimes art is just rubbish. It's just not very nice to look at. Such as this. Okay? This is the map of the modern Middle East. And I can stretch it further into the remnants of the Muslim world. But I can tell you, that is pretty hideous, right? Art normally is an expression of natural ideas. But these are like straight lines on a map. Okay, so these are straight lines on a map. I'm sure, you know, if my son was a few years older, I'm sure, Insha'Allah, he should be able to make a better version of this if I was to give him an empty one without any lines. And today, we're going to be talking about how this hideous piece of art came into existence. So, today you're going to learn about why the Ottomans fell and what happened during that period, how the modern Middle East, and by extension, because over the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at some of the other parts of the Muslim world too. But we're going to start off with the Middle East, because the Middle East became the first experiment. And we're going to talk about something which I like to term as the 4 promises to the Arabs and the Muslims at large. And then we're going to be talking about our future as Muslim nation states. So, the Ottomans, how many of you guys have watched Ertugrul? Right, yeah. Solid series, right? Solid. And anybody seen Osman? Anybody watch Osman? Anybody else watch like other Turkish dramas like Baytat, which is about Abdul Hamid II?
Oh,
Yeah, Baytat. Yeah, I see some. So these are all cool shows, right? Which actually show the grandeur of the Ottomans. So Ertugrul was about how the Ottomans formed. Osman was a continuation of the Ottomans. And then Baytat is set during the end of the Ottoman period. But the 19th century was an incredibly turbulent time for the Ottomans. In summary, and this is not extensive at all, but you know, there's lots of material on this, but there were a number of different themes that the Ottomans faced. They were embroiled in war. So from one side you had the Russians, from another side you had the Serbians, who the Ottomans had control over for a little while, the Balkans. You had problems within the Ottoman lands, such as the Armenians, which happened a little bit later, Ottoman and Druze. So Druze are a community that are largely based around, does anybody know where? Lebanon, yeah. Perfect. And then you had the Ottoman-Saudi wars as well. And this is something that not many people know about, yeah? But it's very important. You also had invasions, by the way, yeah? The Ottomans were also invaded, right? So, for example, by Napoleon, right? Napoleon from France, Napoleon Bonaparte, about whom I think there's a film going to be released. Of course, they're going to make him into the greatest thing ever. But Napoleon invaded Egypt, he invaded parts of North Africa, and he took it away from the from Ottoman control. Debt. Debt was a big thorn at the side of the Ottomans. This is all during the end of the Ottoman period. The Ottomans were embroiled in huge amounts of debt. In fact, this book, which is quite good, Political Economy of Ottoman Public Debt, which surveys all of historical, I mean, the conclusion is all I've read, yeah? Just to let you know. Because the conclusion is what's the beefy bit of this book. Because the conclusion, one really nice bit of the conclusion is, so the Ottomans in 1875 owed £224.5 million sterling in debt to the British. The annual income of the Ottomans was 20 million, right? So it owed 10 times what it had. And of course at that time it was just gold and silver standard, right? You couldn't just print money out of nowhere. So the Ottomans were embroiled in lots of debt. The Ottomans tried to build locomotives, which is like the old school word for trains, right? They used to try and build trains, but they took it all on debt. And you had really poor technology, poor machinery, poor industry, just wasn't, it was largely very much agricultural and not much urban development. Meanwhile, across the shore, you had Europe, right? You had Europe. So we've seen during the Ottoman period you had all of these problems, but on the other hand, Europe had some of these various different things, right? So this is not the Titanic, right? But is a military aircraft carrier, right? So the British ruled the seas, is what they call it, yeah? So the British had a number of military aircraft carriers. So this is, you know, massive technology, right? Ottomans were still using, you know, steel boats and a couple of wooden ships, whilst the British were using, you know, hardcore aircraft carriers, right? Does anybody know what this represents? What this might? Industrial Revolution. What is the Industrial Revolution?
Revolution in industry.
Yes, absolutely. So what type of industry?
Textiles, manufacturing, production.
Yeah, absolutely. Steel. We're in Steel City, right? Steel. If you're from, like, for example, you know, further up north, Huddersfield, Bradford, textile industry, right? Even when you go down to East London, Canary Wharf, the reason why they're called wharfs was because it was lots of textile mills, right? Around canals that can take the manufactured goods elsewhere. So this is what the British economy was based around, right? You had, you know, lots of military technology, right? So you had cannons, you had rifles. It wasn't the old school, you know, take the gunpowder, load it up, take about 10 hours, and then after that fire. It was semi-automatic machinery, right? The gulf of difference with regards to technological development was as big as the gulf itself, right? It was massive. You also had this. This is a little bit difficult to see. Does anybody know what this represents? Oil, right? Black gold, right? Oil was discovered. So that just makes the Industrial Revolution even more revolutionary, right? So everything started to develop massively, whilst the Ottomans were declining massively. Now, if you imagine somebody that's living in Turkey, or modern-day Turkey at that time, and is, you know, still having to walk everywhere, right? Or like carry his goods, right? Hasn't, you know, still having to like hand sew everything, right? In terms of textiles and clothing, right? Got the printing press quite late, right? So people were still writing, you know, documents with their ink. In fact, got ink quite late, by the way. Yeah, the Ottomans got ink quite late, right? So they were still old school kind of feather and like, you know, some black tar, whatever they would be using. Got the ball pen very, very late, so to speak. But you're looking across the shore, and you're looking at all of this industrial development, looking at all of this machinery, looking at all of this, you know, oil, this industry. Naturally, the Ottomans would be thinking, and the Muslim world at large would be thinking, oh no, we need some of that, right? We definitely need some of that, right? We are here, you know, really, really behind when it comes to the world. But when you look at Britain and France, etc., these guys are way ahead of all of us. The additional thing that was happening was that lots of people were going over to study. So people from the Muslim world were going over to France and Europe, places like Spain and England and France, Paris, etc., to study. So they were going over and studying some of the literature and the culture of the West. Famous examples include, for example, in the wider Muslim world, people like Muhammad Iqbal, Allama Iqbal of Pakistan. People like Muhammad Ali Jinnah, right? People like Mohandas Gandhi. These are just individuals, but there were many, many people, right? Evret Pasha, for example, of the Turks. These are people who were going to Europe and studying. So they were infatuated by the growth, the character, you know, of Europe, right? They were completely infatuated. Now, what they failed to recognize, or actually what they came back with, was we need to be more like them. They came back and they said, we need to be like the West. We need to be like Britain. We need to be like France, right? We need to have all of this industrial development. We need to get this money, right? Now, the problem was that they didn't take into account some of the assumptions that resulted in all of this technological advancement. Because technology and technological advancement, infrastructure advancement, doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes as a result of ideas. It comes as a result of vision. It comes as a result of a history. And the Muslims who were present in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, ignored all of these different assumptions and just wanted to get the high-rise buildings. Very similar to Muslims today, right? Trust me, when I speak to people back home, yeah, they think I'm living in Jannah, man. They're like, naturally they're like, you need to come to the UK, man. To come to the UK, to earn the money, we need to do this. And I'm sure you guys have experienced all of these things, right? You guys have no problems, right? Hamad, you have no problems. You're absolutely fine. In fact, alhamdulillah, your Islam is better than our Islam, right? And your ability to practice Islam is better. But what they don't see is all of the underlying, they just see the surface, but no longer see the underlying problems. And what are some of these problems? Maghrib's done that, so now we're here. Europe has a story. And we've got to understand this story. Because the Muslims at that time didn't understand this story. And as a result of that, they got themselves into a number of different problems. The story started with something called the 30-Year War. Does anybody know what the 30-Year War is?
Between loads
Not
of
just
different countries, Spain, France.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, Europeans, they don't get on. Europeans don't get on, right? Just like, you know, when you go to the place of work, alhamdulillah, you know, at the moment, many of you guys might be in friend circles that is largely Muslim. We might have grown up in largely Muslim areas. But then you go into the world of work, and then you start to interact with non-Muslims, right? And then you start to, you know how Arabs have different stereotypes of other Arabs, and how Indians have different stereotypes of Pakistanis, or Indians within India have stereotypes of each other. Europeans have stereotypes of each other. And it's not just like, oh yeah, they smell, or whatever it might be, yeah? It's deeper than that. It's historical, right? It's historical. Because Europe has always been at war with each other. Europe has always been at war. They've always been in competition with each other. When they say World War, it was never really a world war, right? It was between European nations, right? And everybody else got involved as a result of that, right? So the 30-Year War is very important to understand the story of Europe. Because Europe at that time was England, France, what was Germany at that time, etc., etc. But it paid homage to the Pope. Europe at that time paid homage to the Pope. Because at that time, the standard was that the Pope is the representation of God on the earth, and therefore everybody needs to pay homage to the Pope. Now, what happened in the 30-Year War is that some nations didn't want to pay homage to the Pope, right? Because during this period, there were a number of different ideas that came into circulation, okay? One of those ideas came from a chap called Martin Luther, right? It was a German philosopher, right? And in short, Martin Luther basically said, really, what's the use of religion? What's the use of God, right? So Europe wanted to get rid of God when it came to political affairs. right? So what Europe developed was something called Protestantism, or Christianity developed something called Protestantism. You guys have heard of Henry VIII, right? And his 6 wives, right? 6 wives, right? 6 wives. But what was the issue with Henry VIII?
Splitting with Rome because he wanted a divorce.
Because he wanted divorce. Because he didn't want the law of God to dictate his personal affair. So he essentially made England into a Protestant country. Protestantism by itself, of course they're Christian, but they divorce God from the affairs or the day-to-day affairs of people. When it comes to ruling, when it comes to economy, when it comes to marriage, when it comes to politics, when it comes to all of these different things. So the 30-Year War resulted in the splitting of God from politics. That's the first conclusion. Is that clear? Yeah? Right? Europe decided that we're going to split God from politics. The other thing that it did was that it created a division. Because the Pope was saying, you know what, people in France, you've got to support your brethren in Europe, in England, for the sake of Christianity. People in Spain, you got to support the Portuguese for the sake of Christianity. But when they decided to divorce themselves from the Catholic Church, they didn't need to unite for the sake of Christianity anymore. There was no unifying factor. So Europe decided that we're now going to split ourselves into nation states. We're now going to split ourselves into nation states. Okay? And then you had something called the French Revolution, which just took it on the next level. Right? So, we don't really like God. We're going to divorce God from our affairs, assumption 1. Number 2, we're only going to look out for ourselves as nation states. A British is a Brit because he eats bangers and mash. Right? A Frenchman is a Frenchman because, I don't know, I don't want to offend any French people. But anyway, might have something unique. Right? We're going to define ourselves based on our national identities. And then what happened was that the people in Europe started to think, you know, these monarchies, and the fact that you have like, you know, a king, we don't really like that either, right? Because the king takes all of our money, the king doesn't really protect us, the king, you know, doesn't collect and distribute taxes really well, so we're going to go against monarchies. So in the French Revolution, you had have you ever heard of the guillotine? Yeah. Right, the guillotine, yeah? You know the guillotine, yeah? Right, that's the guillotine. So the guillotine was used to essentially kill the monarchy, the French monarchy, yeah? So Louis was killed, he was hanged, yeah? So they had a bit of mercy on him, yeah? So they hanged him, and then after that, they just killed everybody else, including people in the church. Because assumption 1 was, we don't really want God dictating our affairs. Okay? So those were the 3 things that happened. We don't want God, we're going to arrange ourselves as nation states, and we don't like monarchies, right? We believe in democracy, right? We believe that democracy is the best way to organize people and affairs. Now the point of all of this, you also had colonialism, right? European colonialism. So, an extension of this, of some of these ideas, was that, look, because there's no God, well, because we've divorced God from politics, right? And because it's all about us, in terms of the French, we're France, we're going to look to ourselves. We're British, we're going to look to ourselves. We're from Belgium, we're going to look to ourselves. Right? And because it's majority rule now, democracy, right? We're going to vote on it. That basically means we can do whatever we want. Right? That basically means everything is fair game. Because there's no God to tell us what to do. Right? And it's every man for themselves. So you had an entire network of colonial enterprise. By the way, the result of that is us. Right? The result of that enterprise is me. is you, is all of us. So Britain, France, Belgium, all of them had their own colonies. They went to America first, they created their colonies there, then they started to spread, in places like, well, we'll talk about that in a little while. And India, and this is important, India for the British was always the jewel of all colonies, right? Everyone likes karcha, right? Everyone likes biryani. Everyone likes, I can go on. But land, income, salt revenue, so much money came from the colonies. 46 to 60% of British exports went to India, right? The way they used to do it is that they used to import the cotton from India. They used to make the shirts and sell it back to India, right? They completely, and it wasn't just India, it was all of these places, right? Queen Victoria became the Empress to India, right? That was her title, right? So India was the most important thing. That is the story of Europe. All of this that we saw didn't just come out of nowhere. The development, the thing that the Muslims at that time were looking towards, the fancy buildings and the fancy material and the fancy guns and the fancy industry and the printing press and all of these different things came as a result of what we've spoken about. And this is the modern world. The modern world dictates that religion and the state are to be separated. The modern world dictates that nation states are always better than anything else. The modern world dictates that individualism, not family, individualism is the bedrock of society. You only look out for yourself, right? And the modern world dictates that minorities are best represented by democratic governance. This is the story of Europe. These are the assumptions of Europe. This is how European civilization came to being. Okay? And there's a really interesting ayah of Quran that explains this phenomenon. Does anybody know this ayah of Quran? Okay. Can anyone translate this ayah of Quran? Tafadhal. Yeah, absolutely. So the common translation of this ayah is Allah does not change a people until they change within themselves. And the common interpretation of this ayah is that if you want to try and change the world, you've got to change yourself. Right? If you've got to change the world, you've got to change yourself. However, that's not what the ayah is about. I mean, it is, but I'll explain. Verily, Allah does not change a people's condition until they change their... Oh, that's a mistranslation too. I will change that. Themselves. إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُوا مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ. Indeed, Allah does not change. إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ. What is within a people, within a nation, not a person, within a nation. حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُوا. Anybody studying Arabic? This is waw al-jama'ah. This is until they, the people, change within what is within themselves. Him. And this ayah, as the Mufassirin say, is not specific to the Muslims. It's to any civilization. It's to any people. This is why Umar bin Khattab famously said it was Islam that raised us. He didn't say it was Islam that raised me. He said Islam raised us. Because he understood this ayah. So Europe changed their condition. Right? Europe changed their condition from the average man having a shower a year. Right? That was what it was. If anybody read Horrible Histories when they were growing up. Anybody did? Shout out. Horrible Histories. Horrible Histories, a solid book. One shower a year, to having no sewage system, to being this civilization. Because they fundamentally changed the ideas that they operated on. So, the Ottomans, plodding on. So the Ottomans, this period saw a large period of confusion. In light of all of this development that was happening in Europe, the Ottomans were thinking, okay, you know, what do we do? So the natural, they say imitation is the best form of flattery. So they started to imitate, right? They said, the Ottomans, from top to the down, we essentially want to imitate what the West is doing. So even they said, democracy or democratic governance on the basis of national identity is the best way to govern people and is the best way to govern Muslims. At the time, non-Muslims and Muslims felt misrepresented by the Ottomans because the wave of nationalism started to go by. And they thought, you know what, I'm Armenian. You know what, I'm Serbian. It means something to be Armenian and Serbian. We need to call for our national homeland. And the Ottomans tried. They built something called the Hijazi Railway. Has anybody been to Jordan? Jordan. So you know has anyone driven from Amman to Petra? So when you drive from Amman to Petra, you're actually driving alongside the railway, the old Hijazi Railway. Yeah? There's no actual train that goes up and down that, but it's the remnants of the Hijazi Railway. Yeah? So Abdul Hamid II, who was the last actual Sultan of the Ottomans, tried to build a railway to reconnect the Muslim lands. And he actually did. The Ottomans tried to copy the West in the sense that they created something called tanzimat, which were reforms, right? So they, for example, they abolished something called the jizya, which was the tax on non-Muslims. Yeah? What they instead did was that they created a unilateral equal tax between Muslims and non-Muslims, right? They also reformed the law. So as opposed to the heritage, which was looking back at the Sharia as an example to adjudicate between different disputes, they applied the Swiss and French commercial penal code. The thinking, like I said, was, you guys are doing it, let's try and be like you. And the Ottomans were unable to keep up in the end. They were unable to keep up. There was a group called the Young Turks. I don't know if anybody's heard about the Young Turks. Yeah, fine. So there was a group called the Young Turks. And the Young Turks were ultimately a political reform movement of a lot of individuals that were actually educated within the West, but came back to Istanbul, which was the capital of the Ottomans. And they essentially called for something called a constitutional monarchy, right? Which essentially means that it's not the Sultan that is the head of the state, it's the law that's the head of the state. So the Sultan is subject to the law, right? In other words, they were seeking to reform the Ottoman state and make it more European-like, without appreciating the underlying assumptions of the history of Europe, and that's the key point, right? They called for a separation of religion and state, just like Europe called for a separation of religion and state. Right? They called for the breakage, ultimately the breakage of the Ottomans into nation states, right? Into nation states, because they felt that we're Turkish, we're the leaders of the Turks. The Arabs are becoming a problem, right? And actually, we need to focus on ourselves. Then the Ottomans made a massive mistake. They sided with the Germans in World War I. The reason why they sided with the Germans was that they wanted, firstly, they lost a lot of land in Russia, right, previously, so they wanted to reclaim that land because they felt they could reclaim that land. The other reason is that they wanted to stay relevant, right? They wanted to stay relevant in the content. But they had no reason to actually join World War I, right? At all, really. And then, of course, you had Ataturk, Kemal Ataturk, who fought within the Battle of Gallipoli, which was a war between Britain and the Ottomans. It was still known as the Ottoman Empire at the time. And he became very famous, and he officially disbanded the Ottoman Empire. But it was a very confusing time, because it wasn't just a group known as the Young Turks that was supporting this reform of the Ottoman Empire, it was the entirety, pretty much, of the Muslim empire, or of the Muslim world, that was governed by the Ottomans. You even had ulama, like the Grand Mufti of the Ottomans, right? Mahmud Effendi, right? Who was the Sheikh al-Islam. He supported this, the constitutional monarchy, right? To weaken the powers of the Sultan, right? So all of the thinkers within society wanted to be like Europe. And then eventually the Ottoman Empire fell, and you had something called the Treaty of Lausanne, which culminated in the destruction of the Ottoman and the establishment of the Republic of Turkey, right? And that was the end of 1400 years of a continuous Muslim civilization. Now, the West could have left the Ottomans as they were. They could have. They could have just said, you guys just carry on, right? Now, there was a couple of reasons why they didn't. Once again, built on the assumptions that I spoke about before. The first one was that pan-national empires or transatlantic states were too powerful. Because in World War I, you saw the fall of the Ottomans, and what other empires fell?
Germany, Austria, Hungary.
Yeah, Austro-Hungarian Empire.
British.
And Russia.
No, British.
British was World War II. More. I mean, it wasn't, more World War II. But you saw the fall of multiple empires. So World War I, contrary to common stereotype, is not about destroying the Ottoman Empire. It was actually about destroying empires, right? Britain, France, just wanted to get rid of empires. The other thing was that they believed, through their own historical experiences, that the best way to run a country is through nation states. So, dividing the previous empires into nation states is the best way for these countries to run. Right? That was the motivation of the West. Of course, there were more. Now, the interesting thing is, everybody following so far? Yeah? Everybody's following. I know a lot of information to take. But the headlines are the more important thing, the assumptions. So the Ottomans fell. Now the question that was going to be asked was very simple. What about the Ottoman lands? Because the Ottomans were big. It wasn't just Turkey. It was the Balkans. It was North Africa. It was, the Middle East, the Hijaz. It was a large amount of land. So naturally the issue was that, okay, how do we manage the breakage of the Ottoman Empire? And it was important to manage the breakage of the Ottoman Empire. The reason why it was important to manage the breakage of the Ottoman Empire was because, remember, Europe was at war with the Ottomans for a long time. Not just the Ottomans, even pre-Ottomans. Crusades, Anatolia. You guys have watched Ertugrul, when he's like going around, and I think season 4. Anyway, you should probably watch it. I think it's quite a good show. Like season 3 or something, when he's, when he's establishing the Beyliks, and he's in Europe. Remember, Europe's experience was quite a painful experience with Muslim states. So it was very important to manage the aftermath of the fall of the Ottomans. So Europe ended up making a number of different deals. And this is what I call the 4 broken promises. And when you read into this, anyway, I'll let you make the judgment, inshallah. So during this time, when the Ottomans, it was already set in stone that the Ottomans are going to disband, Europe was thinking, how do we manage this? How do we make sure that they're stuck to their national identities? And how do we ensure that another Ottoman state doesn't arise? Those were the main 2 considerations. This isn't conspiracy, this is factual. Yeah? Good books to read on this is something called A Line in the Sand by James Barr. He's got another book called Lord of the Desert. Very, very good books that explore this period. So the first promise, So they came to the Muslims at large, they came to the Muslims, and they said, look, and this is the irony, and this is so important to realize, because the reason why we're studying our history is that we don't get snookered again. Because there's a hadith of Muhammad sallam that the Muslim is not bitten by the same hole twice. That's profound, and it's painful because we keep getting bitten, right? So they made 4 different promises to 4 different parties. Salam. Okay, that hasn't fully come out. But as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ لَا تُفْسِدُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ. Anybody want to complete the ayah? قَالُوا إِنَّمَا نَحْنُ مُصْلِحُونَ. They used to say that we have come, right, that don't create fasad, but indeed we have come as reformers. And the way they presented themselves to the Arabs, to the Turks, etc., was as reformers. For example, when Napoleon came to Egypt, Napoleon said something. He said, "O people of Egypt, you will be told by our enemies, right, the Ottomans and the Mamluks, that I have come to destroy your religion. Believe them not. Tell them that I have come to restore your rights, punish your usurpers, and raise the true worship of Muhammad." This is what Napoleon said to the Egyptians. Napoleon is not a Muslim. Napoleon's French, he's secular. He does not like religion when it comes to politics. Tell them that I venerate more than the Muslims do God, His Prophet and the Quran. And guess what? We bought it, man. We bought it. We were like, yeah, man, that white boy. Honestly, we bought it, right? And it's the same thing, and you'll see. The McMahon-Hussein Accords, which was the first of the 4 broken promises. So McMahon, who was a geezer, British ambassador of Egypt, and he exchanged a number of letters with a rather older geezer, a proper geezer, Sharif Hussein. Does anybody know who Sharif Hussein was? Just say it, inshallah. Go on.
The guy whose family's been ruling Mecca for about 6 centuries at that point.
So the way it worked was that the Ottomans had dedicated, so Hijaz is what you would call modern day Saudi Arabia, but a little bit less. And the Sharif was the man who was appointed by the Ottomans to govern on behalf of the Ottomans. And the Sharif is always from the descendant of Hassan ibn Ali, right? From the grandson of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Hassan ibn Ali. So Sharif was a descendant of Hassan ibn Ali, and therefore a descendant of Ali ibn Abi Talib, and of course Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam through Fatima. Now, Sharif Hussein and McMahon exchanged letters, where McMahon promised Sharif Hussein that he would make Sharif Hussein the king of the Arabs if the Arabs help the British rise up against the Ottomans. Okay? And Hussein was sent a lot of help, by the way. He was sent this guy, known as T.E. Lawrence of Arabia. It's a movie made about him. Lawrence of Arabia. And he was sent £220,000 equivalent to today per month. That's a lot of money, man. That would sort me out for life, definitely. £222,000. So the lure of being the king, and also for, to be, the king was important. That was the McMahon-Hussein Accords. So then that culminated in something called the Arab Revolt. So what Sharif Hussein and his sons did, they sowed seeds of discord. So essentially, they went to the Arabs throughout the Hijaz, but mainly around Bilad al-Sham, around Jordan, Syria, etc. He said, look, you guys are Arabs. It's the same thing as Napoleon said. You're the descendant of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? There's recorded letters, by the way, yeah, of his conversations, yeah. And I'm paraphrasing. You're the descendants of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You come from royal blood. Why are you being ruled by the Turks? Right? Why are you being ruled by the Turks? Right? And he managed to rally the Arabs. He gave them money. He gave them weapons. Right? And the first thing he did, or one of the earliest things he did, was that he was instructed to try and expel Ottoman troops from kind of Transjordan, connecting to the Hijaz, Jordan connecting to Saudi Arabia. So they started to bomb the Hijazi railway, that same railway I spoke about that the Ottoman Sultan built to try and connect the Muslim land. The first thing was to destroy that. In other words, disconnect the Muslim lands. You had the Battle of Aqaba, which was to try and capture the Red Sea port, which is just here. Oh well, sorry, it's just here, right? So the Red Sea port, which is of course the access to the Gulf of Aqaba, and then Suez, and then the Red Sea, right? So Britain really needed that, because for Britain it was to secure the Suez, which was a very important canal for trade, but it was also for them to obtain access to try and splinter the Ottomans from the other side. So this was ultimately orchestrated by Lawrence himself and his son, and Faisal, the son of T. Lawrence. So promise number one was, listen, Hussein, I'm going to make you, if you support me in getting rid of the Ottomans, I'm going to make you the undisputed king of the Arabs. And he was like, yeah, sounds good. Sounds good. Then you had another promise. Right? Has anybody seen these people before? So this is a chap called Mark Sykes, Sir Mark Sykes. And this is Francois Georges Picot. Right? Or Picot. These are two gentlemen. Right? These were two, one from Britain and the other from France. Now, Mark Sykes, he was aristocratic. He had a lot of money. He had a lot of time. He was like our age, but he didn't need to study. Like, he would just be like, oh, I'm going to the rainforest of, Central America to experience the people. And, like posh. Like posh. And it's like, don't you have a job? It's like, I don't need to work. My father has tons of estates. And it's like, that's how he was. So he went to India. So he had his adventures in India. But he realized how important India was to the British colonial enterprise, because of all of the money and the wealth that came. He actually came back and he spoke to government. And he said, the Arabs are inferior in intelligence and they are deceiving. We have to manage them. We can't just let them rule their lands. And he wanted a line, and he drew the lines, some of the lines on the map. You know that ugly piece of work that I showed you guys, the map of the modern Middle East? He actually drew some of those lines, and some of those lines still remain today. And then after that, Picot heard about it. He thought, actually, this was more than just money for the French. For the French, colonialism was not just financial. For the British, they'd go into a land, they don't really care if, the Indian wore the shirt or trouser, or if the Indian started drinking wine. They don't really care. But for the French, it was a matter of identity. For the French, they wanted the colonial enterprise to look like them, right? So for them, they wanted something called an integral Syria, which included Lebanon. Because for a long time, the way the French obtained entry into the Middle East was via the Maronite Christians, right? The Christian minorities within the Middle East. Because the French said, look, we've got Christian heritage, you guys are Christian, so we're going to support you. So the British wanted the outside, Egypt and Iraq, etc. For France, Syria and Lebanon was very, very important. And they created an agreement to split the Arab world into this. These were the lines that was drawn on the original map. Right? And this is the line from acre to Tikrit. That still remains today. So promise number 1, Sharif Hussein becomes the undisputed head of all of the Muslim lands, of the Arab lands. Promise number 2, the Arab world will become divided according to British, French and Italian control.
So the line ended up changing a bit. They gave a bit of Eastern Syria to Iraq.
Yes, eventually. Yeah, that's true, that's correct. So what about Palestine? So the Palestine question remained, because for a long time, everybody had their eyes on Palestine, because it represented more than just land for Muslims and Christians and Jews. And you can see that today, right? What about Palestine? And for a long time, it was, we're just going to default it, but ultimately the British had wanted control over it. But you had a third promise, the Balfour Agreement in 1917. The Balfour Agreement in 1917. And I'll speak about the actual agreement in more detail in 2 weeks' time, Insha'Allah, because it's important. But the Balfour Agreement, well, Palestine was important because of the religion, the religious aspect, because there were crusades and wars fought over it. It, of course, connects Africa and the Middle East. So it's an incredibly important piece of land. And it once again forms the route to India, which is important for, or which was important at that time, for the British. But at the same time, you had a Zionist call for a homeland, right? The Zionist call for a homeland. Because of the persecution the Jews were undergoing within Europe. It wasn't persecution within Muslim land, to set the record straight. It was in Europe. And you had a number of different enterprises, largely economical and banking, because, and I'll explain this, interest is haram for us. Riba is haram for us. Riba is actually haram for Christians. Yeah, I know it's not the reality today, yeah, but it's... But Jews were so... But it's halal for them. But they were so excluded from society, right? Throughout Europe, they were so excluded. They couldn't mix with the people. They were actually marked with red. This is actually true, to distinguish them from the rest of the people. This was Europe, by the way. Yeah? They were so excluded from the entirety of society. All they did was they just kept their money and they kept lending it on interest. They made their money through interest. So it's no doubt that they became banking institutions because they had so much money, right? And they would lend it out on interest. So Balfour essentially said, and I'm not going to go into the terms now, because the terms are interesting, but essentially he said that, you know, the Jews will have a homeland in Palestine. He didn't mention any of the other communities, he didn't mention the Arabs, he didn't mention anything. The actual document is incredibly vague, but it was ultimately a promise to the Zionists. So promise number 1, Sharif Hussein, that old chap, he's like, I'm going to become the king here. Promise number 2, nah, forget that, right? Britain and France are actually going to control these lands. So there's not going to be no kingship under Sharif Hussein. Promise number 3, Sharif Hussein thinks, I'm going to also have Palestine. No, Palestine will become a homeland for the Jews. And it will remain under the British mandate until then, right? So you've got 3 contradictory promises that are all happening at the same time. So then you had, then you had a number of different things. So Sharif Hussein then realized this. He then realized that actually everything that was promised to me is not actually going to come to fruition. So he and the British knew about all of these multiple simultaneous agreements. Sharif Hussein's own son, Faisal, then turned against him, right? Like, it's your dad, right? You back your barber, right? But he didn't back his barber. Yeah, he did not back his barber, right? In fact, he signed the Faisal-Weizmann Agreement, which was the first time the modern state of Israel was recognized, right? The first time, it was in 1919, right? It was recognized that a state for the Zionists can be established within Palestine. Right? So it wasn't the British. It's painful. It was one of our own. Right? And it was the son of Sharif Hussein. So Sharif Hussein is obviously embarrassed. He's realized that he's not going to get zilch from any of this. Right? The British have said to him, look, I know we promised you, but at the end of the day, we don't really trust you. Even though you've done everything for us, by the way. Right? Even though you've done everything for us, we don't really trust you. So we're going to just keep it all to ourselves. Right? And on top of that, the Ummah at that time can see that Sharif Hussein is the one that gave up Palestine. Right? So he, throws a curveball after the destruction of the Ottomans, or around the time of the destruction of the Ottomans, that I am now declaring myself as the Caliph of the Muslims. Yeah? The Khalifa of the Muslims. Because that's the only card I've got to play. I'm going to be the leader of the Muslims. Come on, guys. I was with you guys this whole time. These guys have betrayed me. And then in comes the Treaty of Darin, which was a culmination of the Ottoman-Saudi war. So for a long time, brothers and sisters, yeah, it's important. We've got to read history for what it is. We can't be biased. The Ottomans and the Saudis were at war for around 200 years, where the Hijazi tribe, or Al Saud, was attempting to overthrow Ottoman control from Hijaz, right? The revolt initially was not justifiable, but eventually became justified, right? Eventually became justified. And it became justified through the works of a number of scholars at that point, or a group of scholars. And the justification was that the Ottomans practiced shirk, therefore they are non-Muslims, therefore we can rise against them and shed their blood. Yeah? The Ottomans build graves, the Ottomans grave worship, therefore they cannot rule us, therefore we can turn against them. Right? Therefore we can turn against them. And you had the ransacking of Karbala in 1802, you had the ransacking of Iraq, you had lots of different things that happened. The Al-Rashid family, which I've put in bold here, is actually was the ruling family of the Hijaz. The Ottomans gave them control of the Hijaz. Their capital was in a place called Ha'il, which is north of Medina. If you go to Ha'il today, you will see Ottoman gates and Ottoman-style masjids, or masajid, right? You will still see that. And the Ha'ili people are considerably poorer than the rest of the Saudis. They're considerably poorer. They're the Saudis who drive taxis. They're the Ha'ilis. They're the descendants of the Al-Rashid family, right? They're the people who historically supported the Ottomans, right? The Treaty of Darin, which was between Britain and Saudi Arabia, was the fourth treaty. And essentially, the British said, if you support us in driving the Al-Rashid out of the Hijaz, we will make you the king of the Hijaz. So another contradictory promise, right? Another contradictory promise, right? And the remnants of that remain in modern day Saudi Arabia today. The Ha'ilis, my cousin, who's an English teacher in Saudi Arabia, he lives in Ha'il, yeah? So he tells me some of these things. They don't get state stipends, right? They don't get state stipends. They're largely, from a Saudi point of view, they're second-class citizens because they sided with the Ottomans, historically. And then, as a result of this treaty, Abdul Aziz ibn Saud seized Mecca and Medina, and then the rest of the Hijaz. That's how Saudi Arabia came into existence, right? They turned against the legitimate rule at that time. And it's important to talk about Saudi Arabia. Because, let's be honest, we're all part of the fabric of the Muslim community, right? And trust me, growing up, Wahhabi and Wobbler was like Wahhabi was like the main thing, right? Like, I'm Shafi'i by fiqh, yeah? So like, I put my hands on my chest, yeah? But in some circles, I'm a Wahhabi, right? And then I came up to the north, and then they just invented a new term, wobbler, right? And I just thought, man, this creativity can be like crazy, right? And, you know, for many, it's very difficult to reconcile some of the activities that we see here, the Vision 2030, the concerts, you know, the bombing of Yemen as an example, the large silence on what's going on in Palestine at the moment, right? You know, remote silence on what's going on in Palestine at the moment, with the fact that they are Khadim al-Haramain. They are the people who take care of the Haramain. It's very, very difficult. And we have to distinguish, you know, state-sponsored Islam versus actual, I'm going to use the term, Salafism, right? Because Salafism, right, is very briefly, is actually an approach to try and correct the Muslim condition, right? Very briefly, right? Salafism was actually coined or created by somebody called Rashid Rida, right? Who basically said that if we want to return back to our position as Muslims, growing, etc., we need to go back to Quran and Sunnah. That's a legitimate intellectual exercise in ijtihad, right? That Rashid Rida did. But when it becomes state-sponsored, it becomes very, very different, right? It becomes very, very different. The reality is that the state of Saudi Arabia at the time turned against the legitimate rulers of the Muslims, which was the Ottomans, right? And that's fact, yeah? That's Muslims and non-Muslims that have written about this, right? And this has repercussions. This politicizing of Islamic theology has repercussions. I'll give you a story, briefly. I remember when, does anybody remember the Rabi'a massacre in Egypt? When Sisi,
When they killed the protest.
absolutely, right? When they killed the protesters in Cairo, right, and wider Egypt. I remember visiting a relative of mine, and I was sitting there. There were a couple of brothers, and we were all drinking some coffee and some tea. And they were all like, you know, hardcore, right? Like, hardcore, yeah? And one of the guys said, you know, those guys in Egypt, they deserve it. They deserve to get killed. I was shocked. Wallahi, Allah's my witness, yeah? This is a true story. And I was like, what? Because they turned against their ruler. They turned against their legitimate authority. I'm not going to get into the theology of it, but let's be straight. And I said to him, well, who is the legitimate ruler? And he said, Saudi Arabia. And I said, well, the issue is that the Saudis turn against their ruler. So this is a never-ending debate. It's cyclical, right? We know that many ulama are in prison. Islam becomes redefined based on political interest, right? It becomes redefined. Many ulama are in prison, right? In Saudi Arabia, they get jailed without even criticizing, even a stroke of criticism, or even, why don't you tone something down? Even when they are advising rulers in private, they're still put into prison, right? Such as, for example, the Imam of Masjid al-Quba, who was imprisoned about 9 months ago. And ultimately, Saudi Arabia moves towards a wholehearted adoption of liberalism. Because just like the Ottomans saw in the West that these guys are growing, we need to be like them, without appreciating the underlying assumptions, Saudi Arabia follows exactly the same trajectory. So this is the final slides, legacy of the state. And these are just some important points. The legacy of us as Muslim states, as a result of the division that occurred in history, we have a lack of authenticity in our identity. And we see Latinization as success. You know, Dubai, if you look at it, is a mix of the Wild West, Paris, London, Tokyo, and other capitals of the world. But there's not much Emirati culture within Dubai, or even in Qatar. There is a lack of authenticity and identity. we end up competing with each other for the same set of resources. At the moment, Egypt and Sudan, right? You know when, sorry.
Isn't it Ethiopia as well?
And Ethiopia. But Ethiopia is not necessarily a Muslim nation. They are. So Egypt and Sudan are in a dispute concerning the Nile. The Nile, right? Musa alayhi salam's Nile, right? They're in dispute. But if you look, if you go to northern Sudan and southern Egypt, there's very little difference between the people. Right? Very little difference between the people. You have, for example, the imposition of rules contrary to the desire of the public. It's not about benefiting the public. If you looked at all of the treaties, it was a number of individuals that just wanted land for themselves. The modern Muslim world is made up of what I call mukhabarat states. Does anybody know what mukhabarat is? Intelligence secret service, right? It's policed with fear. Elections with minorities, still feeling they are misrepresented. You know, you have elections after elections after elections, but the Kurds don't feel any much better. The Shia don't feel very much better. The Druze don't feel any much better. The Maronite Christians don't feel any much better. It's just a continuation of the same misrepresentation that minorities have. Our economies are far from developed. What does the Muslim world produce?
Oil.
That's it. Is that even a good? Is that even a product? Olive oil. But is it actually? Well, it's a raw material. Olive oil is a raw material, right? It's you know, you might dispute this. Like it's a raw material. Oil is a raw material, right? There's no actual good produced, right? I mean, you could even say like, you know, like Egyptian cotton is not even produced in Egyptian cotton shirts don't even come from Egypt. They just say Egyptian cotton. Like, I went the other way, the other time, with my wife, and we were in John Lewis, and then it said, like, Damascena Pashmina. Right, so it was a Damascena, Pashmina, which is a shawl, right? My wife was looking at it like, this looks really nice, isn't it? Hint, hint, right? And I was like, man, I've got bills to pay, I've got this to do, that. So I'm looking at it, and then I look at it, so I'm thinking, oh, this might be made in Syria. Nah, it's made in India. Right? It's made in India. SubhanAllah, it's made in India, but it was Damascena. Right? It paralyzes us from national interest versus ummatic interest. What does the ummah need?